My name is Madison Cole, and I'm 34 years old. Thanksgiving night destroyed what was left of my family. We were sitting around a mahogany table in my parents' suburban Connecticut mansion when my dad stood, cleared his throat, and said, "We're selling Cole Manufacturing, and you're getting nothing." He said it like he was reading the weather report. My fork hit the plate. My mother looked away. My brother Owen smirked. And in that moment, I realized my family had just cut me out of the legacy my grandfather built from dirt. What they didn't know was that the failure daughter they disowned was already sitting on something they could never buy. Back the future of Cole Manufacturing itself. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. I grew up surrounded by metal, grease, and pride. My childhood didn't smell like fresh-cut grass or cookies baking in an oven. It smelled like machine oil and hot steel. Cole Manufacturing wasn't just a business. It was the third parent in our house, the most demanding one. My grandfather, Walter Cole, was a legend in our family, a story told over and over. He started the company in a dusty garage with a single lathe and 2 workers who believed in him. He built it with his bare hands, shaping metal and opportunity out of nothing. By the time I was born, his garage had turned into a sprawling complex of warehouses and factory floors, the biggest precision engineering supplier in New England. He was a quiet man with calloused hands who always had a smile for me. He'd let me sit on his lap in his office and show me blueprints, treating them like treasure maps. "See this, Maddie?" he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "This isn't just a gear. It's part of a machine that builds a car, that takes a family on vacation. We make things that move the world." He saw the magic in it. My father only saw the numbers. When Dad took over, the soul of the company changed. Grandpa's office, once filled with sketches and prototypes, became a sterile room of spreadsheets and profit and loss statements. The pride was still there, but it was different. It was colder, sharper. For Dad, Cole Manufacturing was his identity. He wore the company name like a suit of armor. At the dinner table, he never asked about our day at school. He talked about margins, clients, and contracts. He would drill my older brother Owen on supply chain logistics and labor costs. Owen was his golden boy, the heir apparent. From the time he was 10, Owen was groomed to take his place. He spent his summers on the factory floor, not playing with the other kids, but shadowing foremen. Dad would praise him for his killer instinct and his head for numbers. I was the disappointment, the creative one, the variable he couldn't solve for in his perfect equation. I didn't see gears and bolts as just cogs in a machine. I saw their design. I saw how a curve could be more efficient than an angle, how a lighter material could be stronger if shaped correctly. I loved the art of creation, the same magic my grandfather had seen. But to my father, art was a weakness. It was emotional, impractical. It wasn't business. "You'll never understand real business, Madison," he told me once when I was 17, showing him a design for a new tool casing that was both ergonomic and beautiful. "You're too emotional. You think about how things feel. In this world, you only think about how things work and how much they cost." He didn't even look at my sketch. He just pushed it aside to make room for a stack of invoices. It was a small moment, but it felt like a door slamming shut in my face. That feeling became the background noise of my life. Owen would go with him on business trips to Germany and Japan. I would stay home. Owen was invited to sit in on board meetings. I was told to help my mother set the table for dinner parties with his clients. He was the future. I was an afterthought. The biggest fight we ever had was when I chose my college major. He had already decided for me, mechanical engineering. It was the only path he saw as valid, the only way to be a part of his world. I remember standing in his study, the air thick with the smell of leather and his disapproval. I held the university course catalog in my hands like a shield. "I'm going to major in industrial design," I said, my voice shaking but firm. He took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose, his signature move before delivering a verdict. "Industrial design? What is that? Professional doodling?" "No," I said, my voice rising. "It's about making products better, more efficient, easier to use. It's about the connection between the person and the machine." Grandpa Walter would have, "Don't you dare bring your grandfather into this," he snapped, his voice dangerously low. "Your grandfather built this company with sweat and logic, not with pretty drawings. Owen understands that. He's taking the right courses. He's preparing to lead." "And what am I preparing for?" I asked, the question tearing out of my throat. He looked at me, and his eyes were completely blank, as if he was looking at a stranger. "I have no idea, Madison. But it has nothing to do with Cole Manufacturing." That was it. He had drawn the line. Owen was the successor. I was the outsider. It didn't matter that I spent my college years obsessed with my work. It didn't matter that I stayed up all night in the university workshop, building prototypes that could streamline assembly lines, or that I won a national design award for a new type of composite material. I would send him my projects, hoping for a single word of acknowledgement. Nothing. Not an email, not a phone call. The only time he spoke to me was to ask when I was going to get a real job. In my senior year, I developed a concept for a modular assembly system that could cut production costs by nearly 20%. It was innovative, practical, and directly applicable to his business. I spent 6 months perfecting the proposal, building a small-scale model, and running the numbers. I drove 4 hours home to present it to him, my heart pounding with a desperate, childish hope. I found him in his office, of course. Owen was there with him, sitting in a leather chair like he already owned the place. I laid my blueprints and my model out on the big mahogany desk. "What's all this?" Dad asked, not with curiosity, but with annoyance. "It's a new system," I explained, my words tumbling out. "It uses predictive software to adjust the line in real time. It's more efficient, it reduces waste, and it could save the company millions." He glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds. Owen smirked and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He didn't even bother to stand up. "We have engineers for this, Madison," Dad said, his tone dismissive. He gestured to Owen. "Owen is leading a team to look at upgrades next quarter. We have it handled." "But this is different," I pleaded. "This is a whole new way of thinking about the process. It's a distraction," he said, already turning back to his computer. "You should be focusing on finding a job at some design firm, one that will tolerate your sensitivity." I stood there, frozen. The model I had spent months building suddenly looked small and foolish on his massive desk. Humiliation burned in my chest hot and sharp. I packed up my things, my hands trembling, and walked out without another word. As the office door clicked shut behind me, I heard Owen laugh. It was a low, cruel sound that followed me all the way back to my car. In that moment, I knew that being good enough would never be enough. I would have to be better than them. I would have to build something so undeniable that they couldn't ignore it, even if it meant leaving everything I knew behind. When I was 26, my grandfather passed away. The call came from my mother in the middle of the night. His heart had just given out, she said. It was peaceful, but nothing about it felt peaceful to me. It felt like the one anchor holding me to my family had been cut loose. Grandpa Walter was the only one who had ever truly seen me. He'd kept every drawing I'd ever sent him, framing the best ones for his office wall. When Dad had dismissed my projects, Grandpa had called me. "Don't you let him grind you down, Maddie," he'd said, his voice raspy with age. "The future isn't made by people who only look at spreadsheets. It's made by people who can imagine something better." His death left a hole in the world that I knew would never be filled. The funeral was a large, formal affair. It felt more like a corporate event than a memorial for a man who loved the smell of motor oil and the satisfaction of a well-made gear. Business associates from all over the country came to pay their respects, but they spoke to my father in hushed, serious tones about the transition and the future of the company. They were networking at a graveside. My father stood there, stoic and composed, shaking hands and accepting condolences as if he were closing a deal. Owen was right beside him, a perfect copy in a smaller suit, mirroring his every move. I stood off to the side, watching them. My grief felt raw and out of place in the middle of all this cold-blooded business. During the service, I saw my father lean over and whisper something in Owen's ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the look on Owen's face, a flicker of pride, a tightening of his jaw. Later, as we were standing by the casket for the final viewing, I heard my father's words again, this time directed at Owen as he placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's time we take the reins fully," he said, his voice low and firm. "No more distractions." He didn't look at me. He didn't even seem to register I was there. I was a distraction. My love for my grandfather was a distraction. My grief was a distraction. In the months that followed, I tried to find my place at Cole Manufacturing. I clung to the idea that with my grandfather gone, maybe there would be a space for me. Maybe my father would need me. I took a junior designer role, a position I was wildly overqualified for, and tried to contribute. I put my head down and worked. I redesigned the workflow for one of the smaller assembly lines, increasing its output by 15%. I created a new inventory tracking system that saved the warehouse foreman hours each week. I did good work, undeniable work, but it was met with silence. My father never acknowledged my reports. Owen would walk past my desk without making eye contact. I was a ghost in my own family's company. The real betrayal came about 6 months after the funeral. I was working late one night, trying to finish a project proposal. I went to the main office to use the large format printer and found a document left behind in the output tray. It was the minutes from the last board meeting. I knew I shouldn't read it, but my name on the second page caught my eye. My heart started to pound. I picked it up, my hands shaking slightly, and read the paragraph. A motion was made by Richard Cole to promote Owen Cole to the position of Vice President of Operations. The motion was seconded and passed unanimously. This move solidifies the leadership transition plan and positions the company for future growth. Madison Cole's current role in the design department will remain unchanged, with no planned inclusion in upper management. The words blurred in front of my eyes. Vice President. They had done it without telling me, without even considering me. They had formalized my exclusion, writing it down in black and white. It wasn't just that I hadn't been chosen. It was that they had made a specific point to say I wouldn't be chosen. My role would remain unchanged. I was to be kept in my place. The next morning, I walked into my father's office and placed the document on his desk. I didn't say a word. I just waited. He glanced at it, then back at his computer screen, his jaw tight. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said, his voice cold. "Why wasn't I even considered?" I asked, my own voice barely a whisper. "Why wouldn't you even talk to me about it?" He finally turned to look at me, but his eyes were like steel. There was no sympathy, no regret. There was nothing. "This isn't a playground, Madison. This is a multi-million-dollar corporation. Owen has been preparing for this his whole life. He has the right degree. He has the right mindset. He understands what it takes. And I don't?" I challenged, the hurt welling up inside me. "Everything I've done, all the improvements I've made, those are hobbies." He cut me off flatly. "You tinker. Owen leads. You don't have the stomach for leadership. You're too sensitive. You would crumble the first time you had to fire someone, the first time a client yelled at you. You take everything personally." He turned back to his computer, a clear dismissal. "Go find a design firm that'll tolerate your sensitivity. Cole Manufacturing needs a killer, not a poet." I stood there for a long moment, the silence in the room deafening. He didn't look at me again. I was invisible. I turned and walked out, my body shaking with a rage so deep it felt like it was hollowing me out. The humiliation was a physical thing, a bitter taste in my mouth. I walked through the office, past the smiling portrait of my grandfather in the lobby, and out into the sprawling parking lot. I got into my old beat-up car and just sat there, staring at the massive gray building with our name on it. Cole Manufacturing, my name. A name that meant nothing. A legacy I was written out of. He thought I was sensitive. He thought I was weak. He thought I would crumble. And in the silence of my car, surrounded by the empire that had rejected me, I made a silent vow. I wasn't going to crumble. I was going to build. I would build something so powerful, so innovative, and so successful that one day he would have no choice but to see me. He wouldn't be able to look away. I wouldn't just build a career. I would build an empire of my own, and I would do it so far from his shadow that he wouldn't even see it coming until it was big enough to blot out his sun. I packed 2 suitcases, loaded them into my beat-up Civic, and left Connecticut without looking back. I didn't have a plan, just a direction. West. I drove until the familiar green hills of New England flattened into the industrial plains of the Rust Belt. I ended up in Pittsburgh. It felt right. It was a city built on steel and innovation, a place that had fallen and was trying to rebuild itself. Just like me, I had my portfolio and a few $1,000s in savings. It wasn't much. I found a tiny third-floor walk-up apartment in a neighborhood that was more grit than charm. The rent was cheap, and it was all mine. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of terrifying, exhilarating freedom. There was no one to impress, no one to disappoint. There was only me. Getting a job was harder than I expected. I was overqualified for some positions and not the right fit for others. I eventually landed a job at a small firm that designed industrial parts for startups. The pay was barely enough to cover my rent and cheap groceries. I worked 12-hour shifts, sitting in a sterile cubicle under fluorescent lights, designing components for machines I would never see. It was soul-crushing, anonymous work. My boss was a man who saw design as a necessary evil, a box to be checked before production. It was a smaller, grayer version of my father's world, but I didn't let it break me. I saw it as my education. I learned about new materials, new manufacturing techniques, and most importantly, I learned about the real-world problems that engineers and factory workers faced every day. I listened to their frustrations. I heard them talk about equipment failures, inefficiencies on the line, and the constant pressure to produce more with less. Their problems became my obsession. My apartment became my laboratory. After my long shifts, I didn't go out. I didn't watch TV. I came home, made a pot of coffee, and worked. My kitchen table was covered in sketches, schematics, and half-assembled prototypes. I was fueled by caffeine and a simmering rage that had cooled into a relentless determination. I remembered my father's words, "You tinker." So I tinkered. I tinkered with a vengeance. The idea for my breakthrough came from watching a robotic arm on an assembly line at my day job. It was precise, but it was stupid. It would perform the same action over and over, even if the component it was working on was slightly misaligned. It couldn't anticipate errors. It could only react to them, usually by shutting down the entire line, costing the company thousands of dollars in downtime. What if, I thought, a machine could predict a mistake before it happened? What if it could correct itself in real time? That question consumed me. I spent every spare dollar I had on used circuit boards, sensors, and processors. I taught myself how to code, watching tutorials late into the night until my eyes burned. I filled notebooks with algorithms and complex diagrams. My life was a monotonous cycle. Work, eat, sleep, and build. For 3 years, that was all I did. I lost touch with old friends. I didn't date. My family never called, and I never reached out. As far as they were concerned, I had simply vanished. I was a failure who had run away. That thought was the only thing that kept me going on the nights when I was too exhausted to think, when my code wouldn't compile, or when a prototype literally went up in smoke. Their perception of my failure was my fuel. After countless failures, I finally had a working prototype. It was an ugly thing, a mess of wires and salvaged parts held together with duct tape and hope, but it worked. It was an AI-assisted assembly tool, a small box that could be integrated into existing machinery. Using a series of high-speed optical sensors and a predictive learning algorithm, it could detect microscopic deviations in the assembly process and make micro-adjustments to correct them before they resulted in a flaw. It was revolutionary. Getting someone to listen was the next battle. I started trying to find investors. I put on the one good suit I owned and went to meeting after meeting. They were all the same. Rooms full of men in expensive suits who would listen to my pitch with polite skepticism. They saw a young woman with no business background and an idea that sounded too good to be true. They'd ask about my team. I didn't have one. My business plan. It was written on a legal pad. And my credentials. My last name meant nothing here. They didn't take me seriously. One investor literally laughed and told me to come back when I had a real CEO attached to the project. I was close to giving up. My savings were gone and I was deep in credit card debt. Then, one day, I got a call from a mid-sized robotics firm. They had seen a demo I'd posted on a niche engineering forum. They were impressed. They wanted to meet. This time, the meeting felt different. They understood the technology. They saw the potential. At the end of the presentation, they made me an offer. They would fund the development and manufacturing. They would give me everything I needed. But there was one condition. They would own the technology. I would be an employee. They would have full control. I thought about it for a whole weekend. It was the easy way out. It was financial security. It was everything I had been fighting for. But then I thought of my father. I thought of his obsession with control, how he had built an empire that was an extension of his own ego, and I thought about how he had used that control to push me out. If I took this deal, I would just be trading one master for another. On Monday morning, I called them and politely refused their offer. That same day, I took the last of my credit and went to the county courthouse. I filed the paperwork myself. I registered my own company. I called it M. Cygnus Technologies. Cygnus was a constellation my mother used to point out to me on clear summer nights when I was a little girl. She would take me out on the porch, away from the house and the weight of my father's disappointment. She'd point up at the stars, a swan flying through the Milky Way. "That's the Northern Cross," she would whisper. "You were meant for something bigger than this house, Madison. Don't ever forget that." Standing on the steps of that courthouse, holding the registration papers for my own company, I felt like I was finally starting to believe her. It was just a piece of paper, but it was a declaration of independence. It was mine. Founding M. Cygnus Technologies was one thing. Building it was another. With no funding, I had to be creative. I took my ugly prototype and my data and started smaller. I didn't go to venture capitalists. I went to the factory managers, the people who lived with the problems I was trying to solve. I offered them a deal they couldn't refuse. I would install my system on one of their lines for free for a 90-day trial. If it didn't increase their efficiency by a verifiable margin, I would take it out. No questions asked. If it worked, they would sign a 1-year licensing contract. It was a huge gamble. I was betting everything on my technology. The first company to say yes was a small, independent auto parts manufacturer on the verge of bankruptcy. They had nothing to lose. I spent 2 weeks on their factory floor, sleeping in my car some nights, integrating my system myself. The workers were skeptical. They saw me as another consultant with a fancy toy that would make their lives harder. But then they saw it work. They saw the line stop correcting itself. They saw the defect rate plummet. At the end of the 90 days, their output was up by 22%, and their waste was down by 18%. The manager signed the contract with a grin on his face. That first contract was the crack in the dam. I used their data and their testimonial to get my next client and the next. I hired my first employee, a brilliant young software engineer who was tired of working for giant, soulless corporations. Then I hired a hardware specialist. We worked out of a rented garage, a perfect echo of my grandfather's origin story. Within 2 years, Cygnus was no longer just an idea. We were a legitimate business. We had patents pending on our core technology. We were supplying our predictive AI systems to 3 major manufacturers in the Midwest. We were small, but we were profitable, and we were growing fast. By the time I turned 31, I was in a position I had only dreamed of. I was financially stable. My company was respected in its niche. I had built something from nothing, on my own terms. And a part of me, the part that was still that little girl hoping for her father's approval, decided it was time. I told myself it was a business decision. Coal manufacturing was still a giant in the industry, but they were old. Their machinery was outdated, their processes inefficient. They were bleeding money on waste and downtime, the exact problems my system was designed to solve. It was a perfect match. I reached out, not as his daughter, but as the CEO of Cygnus Technologies. I sent a formal proposal to his office, complete with our data, case studies, and a detailed projection of the millions he could save by licensing our system. It was a professional, undeniable offer. I was giving him a lifeline, a way to modernize his company and secure its future. And maybe, deep down, I thought this would be the thing that finally made him see me. He couldn't dismiss this. This wasn't a drawing or a college project. This was a successful business. A week later, I got a response. It wasn't a formal letter or an email from his assistant. It was a short, curt email sent from his personal account. It contained only 2 sentences. "I've seen your proposal. We are not interested in doing business with you." That was it. No explanation. No professional courtesy. Just a brick wall. I couldn't accept it. I picked up the phone and called his direct line. His secretary answered, surprised to hear my voice. "She put me through. What is this, Madison?" he asked, his voice dripping with annoyance. "I gave you my answer." "I don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "This isn't personal, Dad. This is business. My technology can save your company. The data's all there." There was a short, harsh laugh on the other end of the line. It was a sound I knew all too well. It was the same laugh I'd heard from Owen in his office years ago. "Save my company? You really think I would buy tech from my daughter who ran away crying because she couldn't handle the pressure? You have a little startup, that's cute. But don't insult my intelligence by pretending you're in my league." The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing, his anger a palpable thing even through the phone. "Stick to art, Madison," he said, his voice cold and final. "You're out of your depth." He hung up. I sat in my office, the silent phone pressed to my ear. The hurt was familiar, a dull ache I had lived with for most of my life. But this time, something else was there too. A cold, hard clarity. It had never been about my ideas or my abilities. It was about his pride. He would rather watch his company slowly decline than admit that his emotional, sensitive daughter had created something he desperately needed. He would rather fail than accept my help. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window of my small office. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. He had made his choice. Now I would make mine. I had offered him the future as a partner. He had refused. So, I would take that same future to everyone else. I picked up the phone and called my assistant. "Get me the contact information for the CEOs of Sterling Industrial, Apex Manufacturing, and North Star Dynamics," I said. They were his top 3 competitors. They were the companies he fought with over every contract. He had closed the door on me. So I was going to go next door and sell them the key to his house. I would sell it to all of them, and I would let the market do the rest. He didn't want my help. Fine. He could have my competition instead. 2 years passed. 2 years of silence. Cygnus Technologies thrived in the vacuum coal manufacturing stubbornness had created. We didn't just sign on his 3 biggest competitors. We optimized their entire production chains. Our name became synonymous with the next generation of industrial efficiency. I was no longer just Madison Cole, the runaway daughter. I was the founder and CEO of a company that was reshaping the industry my father thought he owned. I read about my own success in trade magazines that I knew sat on his desk. The silence from his end was deafening, a deliberate and stubborn refusal to acknowledge my existence. Then, a week before Thanksgiving, the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was thin and reedy, laced with a forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on edge. "Madison, honey?" "It's Mom." I leaned back in my chair, the view of the Pittsburgh skyline from my office window suddenly feeling a million miles away. "Hi, Mom. Is everything okay?" "Oh, yes, everything's fine, dear. I was calling to invite you for Thanksgiving. Your father and we think it's been long enough. It's time to make peace. Make peace." The word sounded foreign, like a language I no longer spoke. Peace was never an option in our family. There was only victory or defeat. I pictured my father standing behind her, coaching her, using her as his envoy because his pride was too vast to allow him to make the call himself. "I don't know, Mom," I said, the hesitation genuine. "I have a lot of work." "Please, Madison," she begged, and the forced cheerfulness in her voice cracked, revealing the raw desperation underneath. "It would mean so much to me, to have my whole family under one roof again. Just for one day." That was the line that got me. My mother had spent her life trying to hold together the broken pieces of our family, smoothing over my father's sharp edges and Owen's casual cruelty. She had failed over and over, but she never stopped trying. It was her love I missed, the uncomplicated and unconditional affection that had been the only soft place in my childhood. I missed her quiet presence, the scent of her perfume, the way she would gently push my hair out of my face. I missed her too much to say no. "Okay, Mom," I sighed, the word tasting like a concession. "I'll be there." The relief in her voice was a physical thing, a wave of warmth that traveled through the phone. "Oh, that's wonderful, Madison. We'll see you Thursday. Drive safe." The 4-hour drive from Pittsburgh to Connecticut was like traveling back in time. With every mile, the confident CEO I had become began to flake away, revealing the insecure daughter underneath. I passed the same old landmarks, the same small towns, and felt the same old knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. When I pulled into the long, winding driveway of my parents' house, it looked exactly the same. It wasn't a home, it was a monument to my father's success. A sprawling, perfectly manicured mansion of brick and stone. It was beautiful, imposing, and completely cold. My mother met me at the door, pulling me into a hug that felt both desperate and fragile. She looked older, the lines around her eyes deeper than I remembered. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered, her hand trembling slightly on my back. Over her shoulder, I saw my father standing in the foyer. He gave me a curt, formal nod. "Madison?" he said, his voice flat. He didn't move to hug me or even shake my hand. Then Owen appeared, a smug smirk already playing on his lips. Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, his eyes raking over my simple black dress and leather jacket. "Decided to crawl back from whatever factory town you've been hiding in?" "It's good to see you too, Owen," I said, my voice as level as I could make it. The air was thick with unspoken history, with years of resentment packed into a few seconds of strained greetings. We moved into the living room, a space that looked more like a museum than a place where people lived. Mom tried to fill the silence, asking me about Pittsburgh, her questions vague and polite. She had no real concept of my life. In her mind, I was still the sensitive girl who had run away, probably working some small, unimportant job. I gave her simple, non-committal answers, watching my father and brother from the corner of my eye. They were a unit. They sat close together, speaking in low tones about business, about market trends, about the latest quarterly reports. They were an exclusive club, and I was, as always, on the outside. Dinner was a masterpiece of denial. We sat around the massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by my mother's best china and silver. The turkey was perfectly roasted, the side dishes plentiful. It was the picture of a happy, prosperous American family, a lie so perfect it was almost believable. Owen boasted about a deal he had supposedly closed, embellishing the details with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known failure. My father listened, nodding with pride, adding his own commentary about the weakness of their competitors and the strength of the Cole name. They never once asked about my work. They never asked about M. Cygnus. To them, my life was a footnote. A failed experiment they had graciously agreed to ignore for the evening. I stayed quiet, ate my food, and observed. I watched the way my father held court, the way my brother basked in his approval, and the way my mother flitted around them, her anxiety a constant humming energy. She wanted this to be perfect, a fantasy of reconciliation she had built up in her mind. But it was just the same old show, and I knew I was only there as an audience for the final act. Finally, As the pumpkin pie was being served, my father tapped his wineglass with a knife. The sharp ping cut through the low murmur of conversation, and the room fell silent. He stood up, a self-satisfied smile on his face. He looked from Owen to my mother, and then his eyes landed on me, a glint of triumph in them. "We have an announcement," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "As some of you know, the industry has been changing. It's been a tough few years." He paused for dramatic effect. "So, Owen and I have made a strategic decision. We have sold Cole Manufacturing. The deal closes tomorrow morning." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was clearly news to her, too. I kept my face perfectly still, my fork resting on my plate. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, the calm of someone who knows exactly what's coming. "The deal ensures the Cole legacy will continue under new leadership, and it has secured this family's future for generations," he continued, puffing out his chest. He then turned his gaze fully on me. "Madison, your mother wanted you here for this. I thought it was only right that you hear it from me directly. You are not included in the family trust that will be formed from the sale." He smirked, the expression a clear statement of victory. "You left. You get nothing. This is the price for your disobedience." Owen couldn't resist twisting the knife. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Don't take it personally, Maddie. You never really worked for it, did you?" My mother started to speak, a choked sob catching in her throat. "Richard, we didn't discuss it," but my father waved her off, dismissing her as he always did. "It's done, dear. It's a business decision." They all looked at me, expecting tears, or anger, or maybe a desperate plea. They expected me to be the sensitive, emotional girl they had cast me as my entire life. They were waiting for me to crumble. That's when I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, quiet curve of my lips. But in the suffocating tension of that room, it was as loud as a gunshot. "Actually," I said softly, my voice clear and steady, "I know." The silence that followed my words was heavier than anything that had come before. It was a dense, shocked silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My smile, the one I had held back for more than a decade, remained in place. I watched them as the gears in their minds turned, trying to process a response that didn't fit their script. My father's face, which had been flushed with pride and victory, slowly began to change. His smirk faltered, replaced by a deep frown of confusion. His eyes narrowed, searching my face for a hint of a bluff, a crack in my composure. He found nothing. "What do you mean, you know?" he demanded, his voice losing its booming confidence. It was sharper now, laced with suspicion. "How could you possibly know? The deal was confidential. We signed NDAs. Owen let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "She's bluffing. She's just trying to save face. She probably read some rumor in a trade journal." He shook his head, looking at me with pity. Poor Maddie. Always has to be the center of attention. I ignored him. My focus was entirely on my father. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down for the clutch I had placed by my chair. My movements were calm and measured, a stark contrast to the frantic energy radiating from the other side of the table. I clicked it open and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. It wasn't thick, but it felt heavy with the weight of years of calculated work and silent determination. I placed it on the polished mahogany table and gave it a gentle push. It slid across the surface, smooth and silent, coming to a stop directly in front of my father's plate. "What is this?" he asked, staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "You're right," I said, my voice still quiet. "The deal was confidential, but I find that when you're the one signing the checks, they let you see the paperwork." Owen snorted again, louder this time. "Oh, this is rich. Are you going to tell us you're the buyer now? That your little arts and crafts project in Pittsburgh somehow made you enough money to buy a paperclip, let alone Cole Manufacturing?" My mother looked from the folder to me, her expression a mixture of fear and a wild, dawning hope. "Madison, what have you done?" she whispered. My father, his patience gone, snatched the folder from the table and flipped it open. Inside was the cover page of the final acquisition agreement. He scanned the legal jargon, his eyes flicking back and forth. I knew what he was looking for, the buyer's name, and then he found it, printed in clear, bold letters at the top of the page. Acquirer, M. Cygnus Technologies. His breath hitched. He knew the name. Over the past 2 years, it had become a thorn in his side, the upstart tech firm that was empowering all his rivals. He had complained about it at this very table, calling it an aggressive parasite that was disrupting the market. The color began to drain from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. Owen, seeing the look on our father's face, leaned over his shoulder to read the document. His smug expression dissolved into pure, slack-jawed disbelief. M. Cygnus? Owen stammered, his voice cracking. That's not possible. My father kept reading, his finger tracing the lines as if he could will the words to change. He flipped through the pages frantically, his movements jerky and desperate. He was looking for a loophole, an error, anything to make it make sense. He finally arrived at the last page, the signature block. And there, beside the neatly printed name of the company, was the signature itself. It was a signature he hadn't seen in years, but one he knew as well as his own. Madison Cole, CEO. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was immensely satisfying to watch. The mask of the powerful patriarch was gone, shattered. In its place was a frightened, confused old man. He whispered, the word barely audible. You're the buyer? Yes, I said calmly. Your company's debts, its assets, its patents, its trademarks. As of 9 a.m. tomorrow, they're all mine. He started shaking his head, a violent, repetitive motion of denial. Impossible. It's impossible. We vetted the buyer. My lawyers, my team. We vetted them for months. It was a private equity firm from New York, Argentum Capital. We spoke to their managing partner. This was the final piece, the move I was most proud of. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I delivered the final devastating blow. You didn't vet the buyer, I corrected him gently. You vetted my CFO, who is also the managing partner of the holding company I established to make the purchase. Argentum Capital is just a shell, a very effective one, apparently. I leaned forward slightly, making sure he could see the complete and utter lack of malice in my eyes. This wasn't about hatred. It was about justice. You might remember her. Her name is Catherine Hayes. My father's eyes went blank. The name clearly struck a chord, but he couldn't immediately place it. I helped him. She worked for you about 15 years ago. A financial analyst? Incredibly bright. You fired her after she presented a cost-saving strategy that contradicted your own 5-year plan. Your exact words to her, as she told me, were that you needed people who would follow orders, not people who thought too much like a woman. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. He slumped back in his chair, all the air going out of him. He had been outmaneuvered, not just by the daughter he had dismissed as a sensitive failure, but by another woman he had cast aside for being too intelligent. His entire empire, the dynasty he had built his identity on, hadn't just been sold, it had been conquered, and the architects of his defeat were the two people whose potential he had refused to see. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My father sat stunned, his face a mask of gray disbelief. My mother's hands were clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide and full of tears. It was Owen who broke the silence. The shock on his face curdled into a dark, ugly rage. He lunged up from his chair, his hands slamming down on the table, rattling the plates and silverware. The remains of the perfect Thanksgiving dinner trembled. "You can't do this," he roared, his voice shaking with impotent fury. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted. "This is a joke, a sick, twisted joke. That company is our legacy. It's Grandpa's legacy. It's mine." The word hung in the air. Mine. The entitlement was so pure, so deeply ingrained. He couldn't comprehend a world where it was not his right. I looked at my brother, not with anger, but with a profound and weary pity. He wasn't a man. He was a caricature, a hollow shell propped up by a name he hadn't earned and a future he hadn't built. "Correction," I said, my voice quiet, but cutting through his tirade with surgical precision. "It was your legacy. It was your inheritance. Now it's my company. You little bitch." He spat, his face turning a blotchy red. "You stole it. You deceived us." "I didn't steal anything, Owen," I replied, my calmness fueling his rage. "I bought it. Your father was a willing seller. You were both so eager to cash out, you didn't bother to look closely at who was writing the check. That isn't deception. That's just good business. Isn't that what you and Dad were always talking about? The killer instinct?" I let the words hang in the air, a mirror reflecting his own failed philosophy back at him. My father finally found his voice. It was cracked and weak, the voice of a king who had just been dethroned in his own court. He pushed himself up from his chair, leaning heavily on the table for support. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for a hint of the daughter he thought he could control, Madison. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "After everything we gave you, you'd destroy your own family?" The hypocrisy of the question was staggering. For a moment, a hot flash of anger, the old, familiar anger of my youth, rose in my chest. But I pushed it down. Anger was their language, not mine. I had a new one now, a language of calm, unshakable truth. "No," I replied, looking him directly in the eye. "I'm not destroying the family. I'm rebuilding it. On new terms." I paused, letting the words sink in. You destroyed it. You destroyed it bit by bit every single day for 34 years. You destroyed it when you decided that love was conditional. You destroyed it when you decided that my worth was measured by how closely I followed the path you laid out for your son. You destroyed it when you taught him that arrogance was a virtue and taught me that sensitivity was a weakness. I stood up from my chair, my own strength a startling contrast to his sudden frailty. I didn't need to shout. My words were enough. You taught me nothing about business, Dad, but you taught me everything I needed to know about power. You taught me that power in your hands was a weapon to keep people in their place. You used it to dismiss my ideas, to ignore my accomplishments, and to make me feel small. At Grandpa's funeral, you stood over his casket and plotted how to cut me out. You promoted Owen to vice president and didn't even have the decency to tell me. When I came to you with a technology that could have saved this company, you laughed at me. You told me to stick to art. You hung up on me. Each sentence was a memory, a scar I was finally exposing to the light. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for me, to hear the truth spoken aloud in this house for the first time. So I did what you taught me to do. I went out and I built my own power, but I built it differently. I built it by listening to people, by solving problems, by creating value. And now, my power has eclipsed yours. This isn't revenge. This is just the consequence of your choices. You decided I was worth nothing, so you sold your legacy. It just so happens you sold it to me. Owen just stood there, speechless, his rage collapsing into stunned defeat. My father sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. He looked utterly broken, and then a soft sound came from my mother. She had been watching the entire exchange, silent, tears streaming down her face. But her tears, I realized, were not for her husband or her son. They were for me. She rose from her chair and walked around the table, her steps unsteady. She stopped in front of me and reached out, her hand gently touching my cheek. Her voice was a whisper, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Madison, you've become everything your grandfather dreamed of. She looked at me with a pride I had never seen in her eyes before, a pride that was all her own, not a reflection of my father's. It was the validation I had stopped seeking from my father years ago, given freely by the one person whose love had never truly been conditional, just silenced. In that single, whispered sentence, the dynasty of Richard Cole collapsed, and the legacy of Walter Cole was reborn. The 3 months that followed were a blur of controlled chaos and purposeful creation. The day after Thanksgiving, the deal closed. The empire my father had ruled with an iron fist was now mine. My first act as the new owner was not to sit in the CEO's chair, but to walk the factory floor. The air still smelled of metal and oil, the scent of my childhood, but the atmosphere was different. It was stagnant, heavy with the anxiety of a workforce that had been neglected for years. My father had seen them as costs on a spreadsheet. I saw them as the heart of the company. I didn't make a grand speech. I just walked, introduced myself, and listened. I spoke with machinists who had been with the company for 30 years, with engineers whose ideas had been repeatedly ignored, and with line workers who feared for their jobs. The story was the same everywhere. They were proud of the work they did, but they were tired of being treated like disposable cogs in a machine. The changes started immediately, some small, some monumental. We began by rebranding. The large, imposing letters spelling out Cole Manufacturing were taken down from the front of the building. It felt like an exorcism. In their place, new letters were raised. Cygnus Precision Systems. The name was a promise. To my mother, to my grandfather's memory, and to myself. It was a symbol of a new direction, guided by vision and precision, not just by brute force and ego. We redesigned the logo, updated the website, and rewrote the mission statement. The new mission wasn't about market domination. It was about innovation, quality, and respect for the people who made it all possible. My most important act was one of restoration. My father, in his final years of mismanagement, had initiated several rounds of layoffs to cut costs and artificially inflate his profit margins before the sale. He had discarded loyal, skilled workers like they were scrap metal. I tasked Catherine and our new HR department with a single mission: find them. We reached out to every single employee who had been laid off in the last 3 years and offered them their jobs back, with improved benefits and a raise. I will never forget the day I walked through the factory and saw the face of a master welder named Frank, a man who my grandfather had hired personally. My father had let him go 2 months before his pension was set to fully vest. When I rehired him, he just shook my hand, tears in his eyes, and said, "Welcome home, Ms. Cole." In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. My mother became a quiet, constant presence in my new life. She started visiting my office every Friday. At first it was awkward. She would bring me lunch, and we would sit in the newly renovated space, the same office my father had once occupied, now brightened with glass walls and modern art, and make small talk. She was tentative, as if she were afraid of saying the wrong thing. She never spoke of my father or Owen. Instead, she asked about my work, about the technology, about the people I had hired. She listened with genuine interest, her eyes full of a new kind of respect. We were rebuilding our relationship from the ground up, one Friday lunch at a time. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but a slow, gentle mending of something I thought had been broken forever. She told me that Owen had left town a week after Thanksgiving. He couldn't handle the humiliation, the sudden irrelevance. He packed a bag and moved somewhere down south, cutting off all contact. He was a prince without a kingdom, a man whose entire identity had been stripped away, and he couldn't face the new reality. My father retired. He became a ghost in the mansion he had built. Mom said he spent most of his days in his study, not reading or working, just sitting. The sale had left him a very wealthy man, but it had cost him his name, his legacy, and his purpose. I felt no triumph in his defeat, only a hollow sense of pity. He had been given every opportunity to evolve, to accept me, to embrace the future. He had refused, and his world had shrunk until it was nothing more than the four walls of a single room. At the end of the first quarter under my leadership, the profit reports came in. After the initial costs of reinvestment in equipment and personnel, the numbers were staggering. Our efficiency was up 35%. Our client retention was at 100%. Our profits were double what they had been in my father's best year. The integration of Cygnus technology with the skilled workforce of the old company had created a powerhouse. I had proven my model worked. I sat in my office late that night looking at the report. It was the ultimate validation, a story told in indisputable numbers. I thought about sending it to him, a final, triumphant, "I told you so." But it felt petty, an act that belonged to the world he had created, not the one I was building. Instead, I took a piece of my new company letterhead, crisp, white paper with the elegant Cygnus logo at the top. I wrote a single sentence on it. Family isn't who inherits the company, it's who builds it. I put it in an envelope and mailed it to his house. I didn't sign my name. He would know who it was from. It wasn't a message of anger or of gloating. It was a final lesson, a closing statement, a quiet declaration that the future had arrived, and it was being built by the daughter he had thrown away. You've ever been told you're not enough if your ideas were laughed at, or your worth dismissed? Remember this: they can ignore you, mock you, erase you, but they can't stop you from rebuilding what they broke. Like, share and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated, because sometimes revenge doesn't shout, it